Today we're making a knife sheath for my man Maverick. The little rock star of Live a Little Productions turned 8 last month, and on top of being a motorsports phenomenon, he's also an avid hunter and fisherman. In Idaho and surrounding states, 8 is the age of accountability and responsibility. What might be considered by much of the internet as harmful, we consider a child's rite of passage around here. For that reason, I'll show off Mav's skills in this video, but not his face. This all started when Mav showed me a shed antler he'd found. He said he'd really like to have a knife made out of it. I told him my brother Tiny happened to be a master knife maker and we could make that happen. He trusted us with his prize and we made his dreams come true. My contribution to the project was the sheath. I wanted to make him something a little more fancy like this one I made for the knife Tiny made me for my retirement. But knowing the knife was going to see some real action in the field, I thought a bushcraft style might be a little more appropriate. The obvious decision was to make him one of each so he'd have one for hunting and one for church. Now that was a joke, Maverick. You don't need to be taking your knife to church. We'll start with the bushcraft style. I'll do the fancy one in the next video, even though I'm actually building them both at the same time. First, I make a pattern. I typically use a manila folder for this, but this time I'm using a monster truck poster from a show we had to cancel during the quarantine. I've probably got enough of these to last me the rest of my pattern making life. Mav is left-handed, but as a lefty myself, I prefer a right-handed sheath. Mainly because if I'm packing a fixed blade, I typically have a gun or other gear on my left hip. Another reason is because I've been forced to fit into a right-handed world. I decided to make Mav's sheath right-handed because a good knife and leather should last him well into adulthood, and he'll probably find the same to be true. To make the pattern, I fold the paper in half and trace the blade and a fair amount of the handle on one half of the fold. I leave about an 1/8 inch from the spine of the blade to the fold. For this sheath I added 5/8 of an inch for a filler strip that'll keep the blade from touching the stitches. I later found that I should have made the filler at least 3/4 of an inch, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Hold on a sec. Once I have the business side dimensions, I cut it out so I can trace it on the other side. Moving on to the handle section, not to be confused with the horn section. Even though it is made of horn, it's still the handle. This you just kind of have to figure out as you go. Looking at this one, I figured I could follow the line from the inside of the filler strip and just take it to the top. This should leave enough room for a 1-inch belt loop. If you feel you need more room than that, you can just come back this way. I just thought it looked good and did what I needed it to do. The rest is just a matter of what you like and what works. Just keep putting the knife in your pattern, then drawing it up. I do, however, leave the thumb strap a little while just to make sure I have enough when I get the knife in. Because leather is so much thicker than paper, you've got to leave some room in your patterns to compensate. The thicker the leather, the more room you need to leave. If you've watched any of my videos before, you've probably figured out I'm going into a lot more detail on this one. I've had several requests for custom builds and I'm just not in a position to do that right now, so I wanted to make a couple of videos that will take you through the process with a few tools and a little patience. And I firmly believe that making your own stuff with your own hands is good for your soul, especially if you have a sagebrush soul. I've put a time directory in the description so you can skip around to what you need. Leather thickness is measured in ounces. I'm not going to attempt to explain it because I don't really have a full grasp of it myself. But to save you a little head scratching, I'll just tell you that I'm using 7 to 8 ounce leather, and that's about 1/8 of an inch. I usually cut my patterns out to maximize the amount of goods I can get out of a side of leather, but something got on this piece and I had to cut around some nastiness to get a clean shot. You can trace the pattern on the leather with a pencil. A pen would work here too, but I don't recommend a Sharpie because the ink will bleed like crazy and there is no getting it out. When it comes to cutting out the sheath, I just use a good old razor knife. There's better tools out there, but I've never found that I needed to spend the dough on them. We'll also need to cut out a filler strip. This piece will stiffen up the sheath, but most importantly, it keeps the blade away from the thread we'll stitch it up with. This will make more sense later. I make this with a thicker 10 to 12 ounce leather. It's a heavy 3/16 inch thick. Then we need to cut some straps for the various belt loops that this sheath needs. It's been a while since I made one of these, so I have to keep measuring the old one to see what's what. Looks like the Scout carry straps will be 5/8 of an inch wide and the main belt loop will be 1 inch. At least on this one. To make life easier, I make my super duper belt template out of some 10 to 12 ounce leather. I'll use this to shape the belt loop before I stitch it on. To form the leather, I get a little help from my buddy Luke. Lukewarm water. With the leather wet, I can form it around the belt loop with a shaping tool. Then it's time to dye. I color all the parts with a medium brown leather dye. The dyeing process is pretty straightforward. I use wool daubers and apply the dye with a circular motion, and it typically takes at least 2 coats. Don't get too worked up if the dye looks splotchy. It takes a while for the dye to penetrate and even out. With the dye dry, it's time to slick the edges that'll be hard to reach after the sewing's done. I use whatever this stuff is to slick my edges. I have no idea what's in it. I use the grooves on my slicker tool to push the the white stuff into the leather. I mark the location of the main belt loop with a leather stylus. This just leaves a little indentation that can barely be seen. Then I score the smooth side of the leather with a knife before gluing. Fun fact, the smooth side is also called the grain side, and the rough side is called the flesh side. Then I apply barge glue to both sides of the top attaching location. You do have to attach these in order, so don't glue both attachment points at the same time. You'll see what I mean. Let the glue dry for a few minutes, then press the 2 parts together, and I recommend giving it a couple of taps with a mallet or clamping it for just a few more minutes before stitching. Now I do have a sewing machine, but because I'm making this video for beginners, I'm gonna hand stitch everything. I'm using a wax thread, and to be honest, I have no idea what size or weight it is, but I do know that it's brown. I pull off at least 4 times the length of the stitch. Then I put a needle on each end of the thread. The proper way to do this is thread the needle, then pull it out of frame while you pierce the thread and pull it all the way back over the needle. Let's try that again, but with my hand in the way this time. Then we're going to punch the holes. I'm using a stitch punch, but you could easily use an awl or nail to do this. Just make sure your stitch holes are evenly spaced. Now pull the thread through the first stitch hole until you have equal amounts on each side. Then take one side of the thread, pull it through the next hole, and with both threads on the same side, now push the other needle through the same hole as you just pulled the first needle through. Repeat the process until you reach the end, then do a back stitch by stitching back over the last 2 stitches. Now we'll do the same thing on the lower section of the belt loop, and you can see why we had to do this one at a time and in the proper order. I glued the filler strip to one side of the sheath earlier, and now it's time to glue the other side and make a leather sandwich. I glue the 2 pieces and let them kick, then I fold it over, keeping the edges as even as possible as I go. I guess this is more of a taco than a sandwich. Then I clamp it and I let the glue dry for about 30 minutes. It's important to do the next couple steps in this order. First, trim the edges of the glued leather evenly. You can do this with a knife, but I prefer a belt sander. You just need to make sure not to cut it on an angle or you'll have issues with your stitch holes. And the second thing in this process is to bevel your edges. And third, make a stitch groove. The reason you need to do this last is so that the stitch flows with the edge of the sheath. Then I go back and dye the groove and the edge before slicking it all down with the Tonka token, the slicky stuff. Now we'll make the belt loops. For these, I round off one end of the straps that I cut earlier. Then I punch a hole I'll use to attach the loops to the sheath. I hold the strap on the sheath and mark the location of the hole that I need to punch on the sheath. When I said earlier that I made my filler strip a little too narrow, this is why. I've got to make sure that the hole stays within the filler strip. If it protrudes into the sheath, the metal screws I use to attach it will come in contact with the blade. Luckily, I got away with it this time. I temporarily attach the loop to the sheath with a screw and a snap that I'll show coming up. Then I wrap it around the sheath and use light pressure to show me where the next hole needs to go. After I punch the hole, I put the top part of the snap in and mark where I want to trim the strap. Now that I have one strap made, I'll lay it over the other strap and duplicate it. Then I bevel, dye, and slick the edges. It's time to set the snaps for the thumb strap. I put the knife in the sheath and wrap the thumb strap around the handle and mark where I want it. I'm using a line 20 snap here, and this is the line 20 snap setting tool. Turns out my spot setting anvil is just the right size to set the snap. However, I completely forgot that the camera was on the table while I was beating on it. For the final attachment of the belt loops, I use an Allen head screw that I turn down to fit inside the line 24 snap and eventually into the nut side of a Chicago screw. In the final assembly, I use a dab of Loctite to keep it all together. Fingernail polish does a pretty good job here too. And a line 24 snap setting tool is what I use to set the other part of the snap. With everything assembled, I decided to wet form the sheath for a little more security, and I love the way it looks. First, I protect the blade with some plastic, then I call on my buddy Luke again and give the sheath a quick dunk before I put the knife in the sheath and shape the wet leather with my shaping tool. After the sheath dries completely, it will have shrunk just a touch, but not enough that the knife won't fit. After some use, it'll break in real nice. After everything is good and dry, I treat the leather with some shoe oil for waterproofing. I usually use saddle soap and neat's foot oil for this, but I'm right out of neat's foot oil and this stuff will do a great job. It wasn't until I gave the knife to Maverick that I realized I made the belt loops wrong. They should have 2 snaps each for added security like this one. I'll get some new ones made for him, but if you pause the video, you can probably figure out how these are made with the information I gave you. In the next video, we'll make another sheath for the same knife with a different style. Thanks for watching. I'm Kenny. This is Sagebrush Soul, and may the best of your past be the worst of your future.